She had been kneeling by the grave for days. You would have no idea what terrible thing had happened to her until you learned the truth. This was supposed to be her wedding week. Just days ago, she had dreamed of walking down the aisle, of a future filled with love and laughter. Instead, she found herself here, dressed in mourning rather than white, her vows left unspoken, her love buried beneath the cold earth. The townspeople whispered about her, some in pity, others in unease. A young woman, barely in her 20s, shrouded in black, unmoving except for the faint tremble of her shoulders as she wept. The graveyard keeper had tried, more than once, to approach her, to offer a gentle word or a warm drink, but she never responded. She just sat there, her fingers tracing the letters carved into the stone, her lips moving in silent conversations with the dead. The weather had changed, shifting from the warmth of autumn to the chill of approaching winter, yet she remained. The rain had soaked through her clothes one evening. The cold wind had whipped at her hair, but she had not left. At night, when the cemetery gates creaked shut, she stayed past closing, unnoticed by the living, only watched by the dead. A few people who passed by tried to ask her if she needed help, but the vacant look in her eyes made them step back. There was something haunting about her presence, something that made even the bravest hesitate. No one knew her name. No one knew her story. The days blurred together. She barely noticed when the sun rose or when it set, when the world around her moved on without her. Sleep was an afterthought. Food was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was this place, this small patch of earth where her world had ended. The townspeople continued to watch from a distance. Whispers turned into theories. Some believed she had lost a husband. Others thought it was a sibling, a dear friend, maybe even a child. But no one dared to ask. One evening, as the sky bled into dusk, a man approached. He was older, with lines of experience etched across his face. The cemetery keeper. He had seen grief before, but not like this. Carefully, he cleared his throat and spoke. "You've been here a long time," he said, his voice kind but firm. "Whoever you're mourning, they wouldn't want you to wither away like this." She didn't react at first. The wind rustled through the trees, stirring the fallen leaves around her knees. Then, slowly, she turned her head, her eyes hollow but piercing. "They didn't have a choice," she whispered. "Neither did I." The man hesitated. There was something in her voice, something more than grief, a shadow of something darker. Still, he pressed on. "What happened?" She inhaled sharply, as if the words were caught in her throat. Her fingers clenched around the fabric of her dress. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It was supposed to be our wedding day." The wind carried her words away, but the weight of them remained, settling into the air like an unspoken curse. The gravekeeper froze, realization creeping into his face. But before he could speak, she lowered her head again, her gaze locked onto the gravestone. There was more to the story, much more, but she wasn't ready to tell it yet. And so, she remained, kneeling, waiting, lost in the space between love and loss. The gravekeeper stood in silence, absorbing her words. A wedding day, a life that should have begun, now forever frozen in time. He glanced at the gravestone, expecting to see a familiar name, but when his eyes landed on it, a chill ran through him. The date, it was recent, just days ago. Her fiancé hadn't been gone for long. She lifted a trembling hand and traced the name on the stone, her touch reverent, as if trying to bring him back. "It happened so fast," she whispered, her voice raw. "One moment we were planning forever. The next, he was gone." She swallowed hard, her lips pressing together as if to hold back a scream. "They told me it was an accident," she continued, her fingers curling into her palm. But I don't believe them. The gravekeeper frowned. What do you mean? She turned to him, and for the first time he saw something flicker in her hollow eyes. Something sharp. Something like fear or suspicion. He was supposed to meet me at the church, she said. But he never arrived. Her breath hitched. They found him on the road leading there, but something wasn't right. The gravekeeper shifted uneasily. The town was small, and though rumors traveled quickly, he hadn't heard anything about a suspicious death, only of a tragic accident, a carriage gone off the road, a young groom lost before his vows. But now, as he looked at the woman kneeling before the grave, he realized there was more to the story. Much more. And she wasn't leaving until she found the truth. The wind howled through the cemetery, tugging at her dress, but she didn't move. The gravekeeper watched her, unsure if he should press for more or simply leave her to her grief. But she spoke again, her voice quieter this time, as if she was afraid the dead might hear. They told me the carriage lost control, that the horses spooked, the wheels slipped, and he was thrown. Her lips trembled as she inhaled sharply. But when I saw him, when they let me see him, I knew they were lying. The gravekeeper frowned. Why? Her fingers dug into the damp earth beside the grave. There wasn't a single scratch on him, no broken bones, no bruises like you'd expect from a fall. Her voice wavered. He just wasn't breathing. A deep, aching silence settled between them. She let out a shaky breath. They buried him quickly, too quickly. The gravekeeper stiffened. He had been working at the cemetery for years, and he knew what hasty burials meant. Secrets, things better left undiscovered. Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. I keep thinking, what if he wasn't gone yet? What if they buried him when he could still hear me calling his name? The gravekeeper swallowed. He had heard stories like that before, bodies laid to rest before their time. He had even seen one once, long ago, when a coffin was exhumed and scratch marks lined the inside of the lid. A shudder ran through him. She reached out, her fingers ghosting over the name carved into the stone. I should have been with him. I should have found him before they did. Her voice broke. Maybe he tried to call for me. Maybe he was waiting. The gravekeeper took a slow step back. You don't think it was an accident? She shook her head. No, she whispered. I think someone took him from me. The wind howled again, colder this time, and for the first time since she had knelt at the grave, she lifted her head, her tear-streaked face set with quiet, desperate determination. She wasn't just grieving anymore. She was searching for the truth. The gravekeeper shivered, though the night was no colder than any other. Maybe it was the way she spoke, her voice hollow yet filled with quiet certainty, or maybe it was the look in her eyes, something beyond grief, something that unsettled him. He glanced at the gravestone again. The name carved into it suddenly felt heavier, as if it held a secret buried beneath the earth. Who would want to harm him? He asked carefully. She let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting past the headstone to the darkened trees beyond the cemetery. I don't know, she admitted, but I do know that he wasn't supposed to take that road. The gravekeeper frowned. What do you mean? She clutched the fabric of her dress. He always took the main road into town. It was safer, less winding. But the night before our wedding, he told me he had something to take care of, something urgent. Her voice cracked. He was coming to me, but he never made it. She swallowed hard. I keep wondering, what if someone lured him there? The gravekeeper remained silent, the weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't uncommon for carriages to meet their fate on that old road, But something about her story, about her certainty, made the usual explanations feel inadequate. She wiped at her eyes, though the tears kept coming. I tried to ask questions. I begged them to let me see his body again, but they wouldn't. They wouldn't even let me stay long after the funeral. Her hands curled into fists. It was as if they wanted me to forget, as if they wanted him to disappear. The wind stirred the fallen leaves, whispering between the tombstones. The gravekeeper shifted uneasily. "Who's they?" he asked. She hesitated. Then, finally, she whispered, "His family." The gravekeeper's breath caught. The man buried beneath this earth, her beloved, was not just anyone. He was from one of the wealthiest families in town, respected, untouchable. And now the pieces started to fall into place. The hurried burial, the refusal to let her see the body, the silence that followed. It wasn't just grief that had kept her kneeling here for days. It was something else. A question she couldn't let go. A truth she wasn't supposed to find. And as she stared at the grave, her lips parted once more, whispering the words that made the gravekeeper's blood run cold. "I don't think he's down there." The gravekeeper felt the weight of her words settle into the cold night air. He had spent years tending to these grounds, watching grief take on different forms, but never had he encountered something like this. A sorrow sharpened into suspicion, a love that refused to be buried. She stayed kneeling, motionless except for the way her fingers hovered just above the dirt, as if she could feel the truth beneath her touch. The cemetery was silent save for the rustling of leaves, the distant cry of a lone night bird. Somewhere beyond the iron gates, the town carried on, oblivious to the questions left behind in this forgotten corner of the world. The grave had been filled too quickly. He remembered it now, how the coffin had been lowered in the early hours of the morning before the town had truly woken. Few had attended. Fewer had lingered. There had been no time for lingering. She had arrived too late that day. He had seen it himself, how she had run through the gate, breathless and pale, only to find that the earth had already been packed, the grave already closed. The weight of it had sent her to her knees then, just as it kept her kneeling now. Had she known even then? Had some unspoken truth settled into her bones before her mind could make sense of it? The wind picked up, carrying with it the damp scent of rain and earth. She didn't flinch. She had not moved for days, and yet, something about her felt different now. No longer lost, no longer waiting. She was certain. The gravekeeper felt an unease creeping through him, the kind that came with knowing too much or worse, realizing you had ignored something you should have seen all along. The earth beneath her was untouched, too smooth, too undisturbed. Not like a place where something had been laid to rest. Not like a place where something had been buried at all. The night pressed in around them, heavy with the weight of something unseen. The gravekeeper had tended these grounds for years, burying the dead, watching over their silent rest. But now, as he stood beside her, staring at the undisturbed earth, an awful realization crept through him. She was right. A grave should settle over time. The earth should sink, shifting as the weight beneath it found its place. But this one looked as if it had never been touched at all. The woman finally moved, pressing her palm to the dirt, as if she could feel what lay beneath or what didn't. Her breath was steady now, the wild grief that had held her captive for days hardening into something else, something colder. She knew. She had suspected all along, but now, kneeling here under the weight of the truth, she was certain. He was not down there. The gravekeeper swallowed. The realization made his skin prickle, but the deeper question churned in his gut like something rotten. If he wasn't buried here, then where was he? The town had accepted the story. A tragic accident. A young groom lost too soon. They had nodded solemnly, whispered condolences, and moved on, letting the dirt settle over what they thought was a man laid to rest. But someone had made sure no one would look too closely. Someone had kept the truth hidden. The woman rose slowly, her dress damp from the earth, her hands clenched at her sides. She would not mourn at an empty grave any longer. If they had stolen his life, stolen even his death from her, then she would not rest until she found him, until she knew why. The wind howled through the cemetery as she turned away from the grave, her steps unsteady but determined. The gravekeeper watched her go, his heart pounding with the knowledge that whatever she found next would not be meant for the living to know. The night stretched long as she walked away from the grave, her steps slow but deliberate. The town lay ahead, quiet in its slumber, unaware of the truth buried beneath its polite condolences and hushed whispers. But she knew now this was never grief she had been given. It was a lie. The gravekeeper remained standing, watching as her figure disappeared beyond the cemetery gates. A part of him wanted to call out to stop her. But what would he say? That the dead should be left to rest? That some secrets were better kept? No, this was no ordinary secret. This was stolen love, stolen life. Someone had taken him from her, and now they had taken even his death. She would find him. Through the empty streets, past the windows where candlelight flickered, she retraced the steps he had meant to take on their wedding day. The road where he was found. The places he had gone before. The people who had last seen him alive. Somewhere in the quiet, someone knew the truth. She would not stop until she had it. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a single question through the night. Had he truly died that day? Or was he still out there waiting to be found? And as the first light of dawn crept over the town, one thing became certain: her grief had ended. Now only the search remained.